I'll be reading from Genesis chapter 46. So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." And he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hands shall close your eyes."
Seated, please. Okay, first objective is accomplished. I got up here without tripping. That's always important. It is a delight to see all of y'all today. It's wonderful to be here, and I have good news to share with you just right off the bat. This is a 1-point lesson, so it's not going to be a long lesson. I have no slides. I have no spreadsheets, if you can believe that. But knowing many of you the way I do, I was explaining this to Tripp. Yeah, it's just 1 point. He said, "So is it going to be a short lesson?" I said, "Oh, no, I'm going to get wound up. I'm going to talk and talk and talk." He said, "I'm giving you the 5-minute signal at some point." So when you see Tripp do this, you know, y'all can all be relieved. From time to time, Adam has a break. Today is one of those weekends. So throughout the year, we will have different guest speakers. The elders will actually take a turn at this. Mark Dingy will be preaching, as well as those from outside. So there'll be kind of a variety of speakers that we will have through the year. I would ask you to be turning in your Bibles to Exodus 14. We'll actually touch on several verses in Exodus, but we'll spend most of our time in Exodus 14. And just to kind of put this in context, if you think of the very first book of the Bible, Genesis, you see how we learn about creation and sin, the fall of man, how Noah and the flood wiped out mankind except for a few, and then nations were established. As we move into Exodus, this is the whole notion of, especially the first 15, 16 chapters, is how is God saving the Israelites from Egypt and bringing them out of Egyptian bondage. And then the second half of Exodus is really establishing a covenant with man so that we begin to see what does a way out of sin look like. So it's just not coming out of Egypt, but how do we come out of sin? So with that kind of in mind, there's just a lot of challenges with all of this. And I'm looking around the room. I'm looking for Elias Obsaint. I didn't expect to see him here. I'm assuming he's in Chapel Hill. But 2 weeks ago, Elias gave a wonderful talk for the Lord's Supper. It was engaging. It was thoughtful. And as a part of his talk, he needed to refer to people that had some age, some old people. Who does he pick out as an example but me? So I followed up with Elias and said, "You had a 5-minute talk. I get a long talk. Payback is coming." But I tell you what, I owe him a debt of thanks for 2 reasons. One is, by the fact that he can say that, and we have fun with that, it sends a clear message of the relationship we have, that he and I have, and that we all have across this room. And it's founded on love and respect. I have that love and respect for Elias. He has it for me. And with that as a bedrock, we can have a blast doing this. So I appreciate him doing that for that reason. The second reason I want to say thanks to Elias is how that sets up what we'll be talking about today. You know, Elias is about 20 years old. I'm 70 years old. We've got a 50-year gap. And I reflected back on what was life like for me when I was 20. And I thought about all these unknowns and uncertainties and questions that I was going to have to ask. Where am I going to live? Do I go to school? Where am I going to work? How is all this going to work? So many unknowns out there. But then it settled on me that at 70, I have just as many, if not more, uncertainties ahead of me. And that can be a little bewildering, which is actually what brings me to this lesson today. It's titled, God Said, I Will Be With You. So if you remember anything this morning, just always let that resonate. God said, I will be with you. So when we think about this notion of God will be with us, it's a good time to ask. I've asked myself this a lot this week. You ask yourself, do I believe in God? Most people would say yes. You can find a lot of people that says, I believe in God. But do we believe God? So when God tells us something, do we believe it? And if we believe it, then that will change the way we live. Because when God says something with so much gravity, it can change the way we live. When we think about these verses that Dave read for us, here's God talking to Jacob. Do not be afraid. I'm going to go with you myself to Egypt. Put this in context. We have God establishing a covenant with Abraham, and then there's Isaac, then there's Jacob. Jacob has his sons, including Joseph. They were in a famine, but Joseph had been sold into slavery by his brothers, but had risen to be the second in command in Egypt. Egypt, probably the most powerful empire of the world at that time. Now Jacob is going to have to make this transition to basically survive this famine and go to Egypt. But God has provided for that. Joseph is there. They will reside in the land of Goshen. But to give Jacob that comfort of, look at all what he's got to consider. I've got to make a move. But God himself says, I will go with you. So they made that transition. They moved to Egypt, and it worked. They survived. So in making these kind of moves, having that comfort by God is so, so important and reassuring. But look what transpires over the next 400 years. Pharaoh's died, Joseph died, all his brothers died. Things began to change. And to put this in perspective, think about what existed here 400 years ago. If you think in the 1600s here, we had a few explorers. We had a few settlers. There was no nation. Think about what has evolved right here in this land where we live for the past 400 years. Think of all the changes that have taken place. Well, think about the changes for this family of Israelites and what happened to them over 400 years. They were embedded in the Egyptian culture. Many gods, paganism. You had this, the authoritarian rule of the pharaohs. All of this changed. It transformed people from what was about 70 members of Jacob's family that came there to survive. They've now themselves turned into hundreds of thousands of people. They've grown, they've multiplied. And, they have been enslaved. So instead of living in the land of Goshen where they could have, plenty of their livestock, their animals, now they were enslaved to the Pharaoh government. So it was a complete transformation of what was happening there. So when we begin to look at then what happened in Exodus, I think about their cries for help. So if you're in Exodus, go flip to chapter 2, verses 23, 25. So when we see in Exodus, it came about in the course of those many days, the king of Egypt died, the sons of Israel sighed because of their bondage, and they cried out. And their fear for help because of their bondage rose to God. Now, what then occurred? So God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel. God took notice. God knows. So when we think of God who hears, remembers, he sees us, he knows our plight, we can take comfort in that. So God calls Moses, who himself was a pretty incredible story of how he has now risen. But in chapter 3, say picking up around verse 10 of chapter 3, therefore come now, and I will send you, Moses, to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. This is a pretty intimidating task here. So Moses says, but who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, certainly, I will be with you. And there shall be a sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, that you shall worship at this mountain. So here's God giving his assurance to Moses, I will be with you. And you look at the plight of the Israelites. Exodus 5, bricks without straw. Here, people were enslaved to Pharaoh. This particular place, make bricks. Now, you could make bricks with straw. They could still be strong, but they were a little lighter. They said, don't even go gather the straw. You keep making the bricks. You got to make just as many bricks as you always have. But now they were much heavier. They were increasing the workload on the Israelites. So it just became more burdensome. Then, as their cries lifted up to God, look at Exodus 6 in verse 6. As he's sending Moses in that he is promising action. I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with outstretched arms and great judgment. Now, how God went about this, he brought plagues. So this begins 10 plagues that were put on Egypt to begin to send that message to Pharaoh that these are my people. So when we think about these acts of nature, how it inflicted pain, could it not change the mind of Pharaoh? So the first 5 plagues was actually things that he could have changed. Pharaoh did, but he didn't. He made the decision, no, this is what I'm going to do. We're going to hold on to these people. So kind of in the middle of that, there in about chapter 9, he reminds them that I will send plagues on you and your servants and your people so that you may know there is no one like me on earth. And this is God speaking. My power, I will show you my power in order to proclaim my name. So when we think about this powerful God, that plagues would be coming down on Pharaoh so that you will know I am powerful. So then as we move to Exodus 13 through Exodus 13, verses 17 and 18, when Pharaoh had let the people go, he finally buckled at that 10th plague where even his son was not spared. Let him go. So when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the Philistines, even though it was near. If you think of a map of where Egypt is, Sinai Peninsula, just shooting straight across, going towards what is now Israel, would be the shortest path. But they had to go through the land of Palestine where those Philistines were. So he didn't lead them that way, even though it was near. He said the people might change their mind when they see war and return to Egypt. Much like we talked about in our Bible class this morning, no relapse. So don't get into a situation where these people are going to grow weak and just say, I'll just go back to Egypt. So to drive this point home, here in chapter 14, we can see what's happening. And it's just an incredible depiction of God's power. In the first 4 verses there of chapter 14, here's the Lord speaking to Moses. All right, here's where you're going to camp. You're going to move around to different places. Pharaoh has spies here. He's watching. And they're saying they're wandering aimlessly about. They must be lost. This is the time we can probably take them. And the Lord says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after them, and I, God, will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army. And so they did. So in verse 5 of chapter 14, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart towards the people, and they said, "What is this we have done? Why did we let them go from serving us?" Now you would think Pharaoh is surrounded by lots of advisors. And when Pharaoh's asking, "Why did we let them go?" could there not have been one advisor that said, I can think of 10 pretty good reasons why we let them go. But no, at that point they're saying, we're going to go get them back. They forget so easily. Pharaoh forgets, and we forget. So this is where we want to remember. So if Pharaoh couldn't remember after having 10 plagues, he's probably going to get what he deserves. So as we go through this, they roll out their 600 chariots and all other chariots. I'll make a comment about this. Most powerful empire in the world, Egypt, rolling out chariots, which happens to be the most sophisticated weapon you can have at that time. Men on a chariot, mobile with an archer. They literally ran circles around other armies, could pick people off. That was one of the reasons Egyptians were so powerful at that time. It's like having modern day our nuclear missiles. If somebody's pointing a nuclear missile at you, you can probably have it's probably understanding to be a little concerned about that. But that's what was bearing down on these folks. So then in verse 6, he made his chariots ready. He took people with him. He took 600 select chariots and all other chariots, and there they go. They are going after these people, even though the people were going out of Egypt boldly. So the Israelites were moving out boldly. They were confident. Defiantly is actually the term that I have in this version, going out boldly, because they were no longer under the authority of the Egyptians. So they could go out in that way. You could tell they appreciated their freedom. They were delighted to be able to leave this Egyptian rule, and how confident they were right there in verse 8. So the Egyptians chased after them. Verse 10, 2 verses later, as they drew near, the sons of Israel looked, and behold, they saw the Egyptians marching after them. They became frightened. And the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. They were bold. They were no longer Egyptian rule. A very short time later, they were frightened, and they were crying out to the Lord. This is the Lord that had sent 10 plagues. It was the power that he had, but right now, they couldn't see a way out. Now, I'm not going to throw any stones at the Israelites. If I'm looking at 600 and more chariots coming after me, I've got my back to the sea. There is no way out. I'm crying out to the Lord. I understand it. But now they cry out to Moses in verse 11. Is it because there were no graves in Egypt you've taken us away here to die in the wilderness? There's a little sarcasm here. Egypt is full of graves. They've got tombs everywhere. They invented embalming. They've got pyramids. They're the most grave-oriented people. And in fact, anywhere there's dirt, there's graves. So they're using sarcasm here because they're now crying out to Moses, why have you dealt with this? Just bring us out of Egypt. Is it not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt? Oh, now, think about this. Oh, didn't we tell you, like I told you so when we were in Egypt, that we shouldn't leave? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? I don't think so. I think they were crying out to get out from under that burden. Exodus 5, it was so harsh to them. But now they've changed their tune. They're basically romanticizing what life was like in the past. we all have to be very cautious about romanticizing the past. So then, as we get to this, Moses said to the people, and highlight these here in verse 13, you do not fear. You stand by, you stand firm. Don't you waver in your faith or your belief, and you see the salvation of the Lord. Now you watch the Lord, don't look at yourselves, and as you're doing that, you will see what he accomplishes for you today. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. Now there's an interesting aspect of going from verse 14 to 15. Now, what we're not told is what Moses knows or what he doesn't know. And when he is telling them this, to stand firm and see the salvation and do not fear, I don't know what insight he has. But based on God's response to Moses in 15, my supposition is he is confident that the Lord is going to do what the Lord says he's going to do. He may not know how. So I could see Moses turning around to God of saying, okay, our backs are against the sea. I see these Egyptians. I'm delivering the message. What are we going to do, God? What are you going to do? Maybe he just doesn't know. Maybe he's crying out to the Lord himself. And the Lord says in 15, why are you crying out to me, Moses? You tell the sons of Israel to go forward. So there's something for them to do. There's something for us to do. So when we think about it, we do not want to fear. We want to hold on to our faith. We want to see the Lord and his actions, but there's an action for us. Go forward. Don't go romanticize about Egypt. Don't go back to Egypt. You go forward, and that's very, very clear. So Moses, you lift up your staff. Sons of Israel, you move forward, and then I'll tell you what I'll do. In verse 17, as for me, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, so they will go in after them. I will be honored through Pharaoh and the loss of his army. So this is where the Lord, and then the Lord takes another step, verses 19 and 20. He is our protector. I'll move an angel behind the people of Israel. There is a cloud there. He even buffers the Egyptians from the Israelites as they move through the sea. And Moses, as they walked through, he stretched out their hand. He stretched out their hand, they walked through, they moved through. He stretched out his hand again. The waters came back together. And there, they could then, in verse 31, they saw the great power of the Lord and how it was used against the Egyptians, and how they feared the Lord, and how they believed in all that happened. Too often, we might not be able to see some of these things. Having Dwayne up here leading a prayer reminded me of something. Now, sometimes we cannot see things clearly. Dwayne's from Tennessee, and he and I happen to know we're familiar with the same guy from Nashville. And he told the story of where he had a business trip. He went to Florida, and he was down there for several days. And while he was there, he was able to work in a golf game. Now, for our native Floridians in the room, Florida is hot. Florida is humid. You get out here and you play around the golf, you're sweaty, you're sticky, you're uncomfortable. So after his golf game, he came back up to the parking lot. He was going to take his golf shoes off, put on other shoes before he went into the clubhouse. So while he was doing this, he said, I have got this fresh, clean shirt right over here in the trunk of my car. I think I'll slip that on too. It'll just be so much more comfortable. So he took his shirt off, and then he was reaching in to get this fresh, clean shirt. But what he didn't realize was there was this older gentleman who had walked up behind him. And the older gentleman said, Olivia? And he said, excuse me? Oh, I'm sorry, I was looking for my wife. If you could just picture this, that we don't have enough time to talk about all the things that are wrong about this picture. Sometimes we might think we know who we're looking for. We can be a little confused. Sometimes we're distracted. But just like the older man in the parking lot thinking he had found Olivia when he had actually found Nate, it just wasn't going to work. So we have to be so conscientious about who we're looking for and how we're attuned to that. Because Moses himself in Numbers 20, when people were grumbling, they were thirsty, he approaches the rock, strikes the rock rather than speaks to the rock for water to flow out of it. And it's because he didn't revere God. It wasn't something of where he was pointing to God being holy. But as he moved past that, and near the end of Moses' life in Deuteronomy 31, what he tells the people of Israel is be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or tremble. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. God essentially says this same thing to Joshua as Joshua begins to lead the people into the promised land. So just as I've been with you, just as I've been with Moses, I will be with you, Joshua. I will not fail nor forsake you. Is it not I that commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not tremble or be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So those are the kind of comforting words that we can have as we move through this life. But I got an important point for you. We can have this kind of faith. We can have a deep, deep, trusting relationship with God. But we're still going to have challenges. So does that compute? Let's think about that for a minute. I don't want you to leave here saying, all I got to do is believe God's with me and I'm on easy street. Actually not. We're going to have the same challenges through life, but how we deal with them. What is our mindset and how is our mindset different because of knowing that Jesus is with us, that God will be with us? When you think about unknowns, and there can be a lot of unknowns in our life, we can be anxious and worried and distracted, or we can be at peace and we can be calm and we can be assured, even though we have unknowns, because we're going to have unknowns. There are things that are uncertain. It can cause stress. It can cause us to be discouraged or despair. We could lose confidence. Or we can be optimistic. We can take comfort, even though there's uncertainties out there in front of us. There can be questions that we don't have an answer to. That can make us restless. Oh, we can be uneasy. We can even be doubtful. We can second guess ourselves. Or we can be patient. We can be steadfast in prayer, even if we have uncertainties and unanswered questions. Sometimes we're dealt a bad hand. That can just be bad outcomes. There can be things that happen to us through no fault of our own. So we can either be bitter, or we can be resentful, or we can be grateful for what we have learned, because we're all going to have trials. We can be wronged in some way. We can be offended. We can be a victim. We could want to do payback. Or, on the other side, we can leave judgment and vengeance to God. We can strive to forgive. When we have a challenge, we can be just paralyzed with fear. What do I do? Where do I go? How do I approach this? We can just refuse to move, or we can move forward. We can be willing. We can be willing and move forward with boldness and confidence. The other thing I would caution us on is when good things happen. Just wonderful things can happen. On one side, I can say, look at what I accomplished. Or, that's a situation where we can express gratitude for how something was done or given, how someone contributed, and we appreciate that. But when we know God is with us, we're going to be able to face these uncertainties and challenges and bad outcomes and good outcomes in a much different way than if we didn't believe God is with us. One thing that's incredible about reading the Bible is that I can read verses 100 times. And every time I may pick out something a little different about a verse of saying, interesting. Oh, yeah, I want to emphasize that. When I was thinking about this particular lesson, Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20, this is one of those examples where all authority, this is Jesus talking, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I commanded you. And I think, absolutely, that's our mission. I want to be full of Jesus. I want to tell people about Jesus everywhere I go and whoever I talk to. But this week, I paid a lot more emphasis to the very last phrase of that verse. And lo, I am with you always. Look at that. Even in the mission that God gives us, that Jesus gives us, He's right there with us every step of the way, even as we're carrying that out. A couple of weeks ago, Adam gave the lesson on Mark 4 of Jesus sending the disciples on ahead across the sea. They were in choppy waters, they were nervous, and Jesus was walking on the water beside them. And in Mark's account of that, Jesus intended to walk past them, but they cried out to Jesus. So what did Jesus do? He got in the boat with them. This is one of those examples that He knows what we need before we even know it ourselves. In Hebrews, we're reminded that He will never forsake us. In Galatians 2, Jesus will reside in our hearts. He just won't get in the boat with us. He will reside in our hearts. And it's those kind of things that can give us a tremendous amount of comfort. It's what gives us confidence. It's what changes our mind, knowing that God said He will be with us. God said, do not be afraid. God said, go forward. So today, I would say, let's go forward together.